For most of human history, walking through an old-growth forest meant craning your neck upward at trees that seemed to touch the clouds. Redwoods in California stretched over 300 feet into the sky. Douglas firs in the Pacific Northwest rose nearly as high. These weren't just big trees, they were ecological monuments, standing for 1,000 years or more. But here's what economics class doesn't teach you. Those 300-foot giants didn't stand on shallow roots. For every foot that stretched toward the sun, there was an intricate network spreading underground. Some redwood root systems extended outward for an acre or more, interweaving with neighboring trees to create a foundation that could withstand earthquakes and storms that would flatten anything built by human hands. The tallest trees required the deepest roots. That's not poetry, that's physics. Now, imagine an economy built the same way. Imagine industrial empires rising 40 miles into the stratosphere. Manufacturing systems so vast, they employed entire regions. Supply chains so complex, they circled the globe 3 times over. If those economic trees grew that tall, how deep do you think the roots went? The answer is going to rewrite everything you thought you knew about how wealth actually gets created in America. Between 1865 and 1920, something happened in the United States that had never occurred in human history at that scale or speed. The industrial output of the entire country increased by over 1,200%. Steel production went from practically nothing to dominating the world market. Railroad track mileage exploded from 35,000 mile to over 250,000 mile. The population doubled, but productive capacity increased 12 times over. Economists call this the Second Industrial Revolution. They frame it as a story about innovation, about brilliant inventors and risk-taking entrepreneurs who built empires through sheer will and superior business acumen. Andrew Carnegie in steel, John Rockefeller in oil, J.P. Morgan in finance, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads. These men became legends. They're still taught in business schools today as examples of how capitalism rewards excellence and hard work. But that narrative has a problem. It ignores the roots. The story you've been told goes something like this. In the late 1800s, America had abundant natural resources, a growing population, and minimal government regulation. Visionary entrepreneurs seized the opportunity, built massive companies, and created unprecedented wealth. Their success was the result of superior products, efficient operations, and the magic of the free market. It's a clean story, simple, inspiring even. It's also incomplete to the point of deception. Here's what actually happened. Between 1865 and 1900, the federal government handed over approximately 180 million acres of public land to railroad companies. To put that in perspective, that's an area roughly the size of Texas. Not sold, not leased, handed over for free, with the explicit understanding that these companies would build the infrastructure that the entire industrial economy would run on. The Northern Pacific Railroad alone received 40 million acres, more land than the entire state of Florida. The Union Pacific got 20 million acres of prime territory. The Central Pacific secured vast stretches of California and Nevada. This wasn't a loan. It wasn't a subsidy. It was a direct transfer of public wealth into private hands, justified by the claim that only private enterprise could build the railroads the country needed. And it worked, in a sense. The railroads got built. But here's the part that gets left out of the triumphant narrative. Those railroads didn't just transport goods. They created the entire geography of American commerce. Towns that got railroad access thrived. Towns that didn't died. Industries that could ship by rail expanded. Industries that couldn't went bankrupt. The railroads didn't just participate in the economy. They decided which parts of the economy would exist at all. When Andrew Carnegie built his steel empire, he didn't do it in a vacuum. He did it with guaranteed access to the transportation network that the government had subsidized into existence. When Rockefeller monopolized oil, he did it by leveraging preferential rates from those same railroads. rates that smaller competitors couldn't access. The fortunes at the top weren't just built on innovation, they were built on infrastructure that public resources created and private interests controlled. The roots went deep, deeper than anyone wants to admit. Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's empire, is held up as the ultimate example of capitalist efficiency. At its peak, in 1904, Standard Oil controlled about 91.7% of oil refining in the United States and 85% of final sales. Business schools teach this as a case study in vertical integration and operational excellence. But here's what they don't mention. Between 1870 and 1906, Standard Oil benefited from a legal structure that made monopoly not just possible, but nearly inevitable. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of consolidation. But it wasn't enforced for over a decade. During that window, Rockefeller crushed competitors through tactics that would be prosecuted as illegal today. He negotiated secret rebates with railroads, meaning Standard Oil paid lower shipping rates than competitors. In some cases, the railroads even paid Rockefeller a fee for every barrel that his competitors shipped. Rockefeller's competitors were literally funding his operations every time they tried to do business. When smaller refineries refused to sell to Standard Oil, Rockefeller would slash prices in their local markets below the cost of production, absorbing losses that his vast reserves could sustain, but that would bankrupt smaller operations within months. Once the competitor folded, Standard Oil would buy their assets for pennies on the dollar and immediately raise prices again. This wasn't superior business acumen. This was predatory pricing enabled by the kind of capital accumulation that only comes from controlling infrastructure that public investment created. The roots weren't just deep, they were invasive. By 1900, the United States had become the world's leading industrial power. But the wealth that explosion created didn't distribute evenly. Between 1890 and 1920, the richest won. Percent of Americans controlled approximately 40% of the nation's wealth. The Gilded Age wasn't called that because everyone got rich. It was called that because a thin layer of gold covered a foundation of poverty that most people couldn't see unless they looked closely. Factory workers in this era typically worked 60 to 72 hours per week for wages that barely covered subsistence. Child labor was standard. In 1900, approximately 18% of all workers in the United States were under the age of 16. Some were under the age of 10, working in coal mines, textile mills, and glass factories under conditions that today would be classified as torture. The same railroads that carried Carnegie's steel also carried strikebreakers to crush labor organizing. The same banks that financed Rockefeller's expansion also financed the Pinkertons, private security forces hired to intimidate and sometimes kill workers who demanded safer conditions or fair wages. This wasn't a side effect of industrialization. It was the foundation. The 40-mile-tall trees required roots that consumed everything around them. Let's shift to a specific case. The Homestead Strike of 1892. The Andrew Carnegie Steel Plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, was one of the most productive facilities in the world. The workers there weren't unskilled laborers. They were highly trained craftsmen operating some of the most advanced industrial equipment on the planet. In 1892, the union at Homestead demanded wage increases that would bring their pay in line with the profits the plant was generating. Carnegie, who publicly positioned himself as a supporter of workers' rights and had even written essays about the responsibilities of the wealthy to society, refused. He left town and put Henry Clay Frick, his plant manager, in charge of negotiations. Frick didn't negotiate. He locked out the workers, built a fence around the plant topped with barbed wire, and hired 300 Pinkerton agents to take control of the facility by force. On July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons arrived by barge on the Monongahela River. The workers, anticipating this move, were waiting on the shore. A firefight broke out. 10 people died. Dozens more were wounded. The state government sent 8,500 National Guard troops to break the strike. The plant reopened with non-union labor. The union was destroyed. Carnegie returned from Scotland, expressed regret about the violence, and continued to build one of the largest personal fortunes in American history. He later donated hundreds of millions of dollars to build libraries, universities, and concert halls. His name is still on buildings across the country. But those libraries were built with profits extracted from a system where challenging your employer could get you killed by state-sanctioned military force. The roots weren't just deep, they were enforced at gunpoint. Now, here's where the revisionist part gets uncomfortable. Everything I've described so far is documented historical fact. You can find it in archives, in court records, in newspapers from the era. But the framing matters. The standard narrative treats these events as exceptions, as excesses of an otherwise functional system that eventually corrected itself through antitrust laws and labor regulations. The revisionist view asks a different question. What if these weren't exceptions? What if this was the system working exactly as designed? When the federal government handed 180 million acres to railroad companies, that wasn't a mistake. It was policy. When state governments sent troops to break strikes, that wasn't a deviation from neutrality. That was the state picking a side. When banks financed monopolies that destroyed competition, that wasn't a market failure. That was the market working exactly as the people with the most capital intended. The question isn't whether the trees grew tall. Obviously, they did. The question is whether we're willing to acknowledge that the height came at a cost that was paid by people whose names don't appear in any business school case study. Let's look at another root system: the tariff policies of the late 19th century. Between 1865 and 1913, the United States maintained some of the highest protective tariffs in the world. These tariffs made imported goods significantly more expensive than domestically produced goods, which created a captive market for American manufacturers. This is often taught as smart policy, a way to protect infant industries until they could compete globally. But there's a darker reading. The tariffs functioned as a massive wealth transfer from consumers to industrial producers. Every American who bought clothing, tools, or household goods paid inflated prices. The average tariff rate in the 1890s was around 50%. That means a product that would cost $1 in a free market cost $1.50 in the United States. For a working-class family, spending 80% of their income on necessities, that extra 50 cents per dollar was devastating. For a factory owner selling millions of units, that extra 50 cents per unit was a fortune. This wasn't neutral policy. It was a deliberate choice about who would bear the cost of industrialization. The trees grew tall because the roots extracted resources from everyone below them. Let's go deeper into the banking system. In 1907, the United States experienced a financial panic that nearly collapsed the entire economy. Banks failed. The stock market crashed. Businesses went bankrupt overnight. The crisis was eventually stabilized, but not by the government. J.P. Morgan, at that point the most powerful banker in the country, organized a private consortium of financiers who pooled resources to keep key institutions afloat. This is often taught as an example of enlightened self-interest, of private actors stepping up when the government couldn't. But consider what it actually meant. A handful of private individuals had more power to stabilize the economy than the entire federal government. That's not a market, that's an oligarchy, and that oligarchy didn't use its power out of charity. In exchange for bailouts, Morgan and his allies acquired assets at fire sale prices, consolidating even more control over the financial system. The 1907 panic didn't redistribute power. It concentrated it further. This is the part of the root system that most people never see. The financial infrastructure that enabled industrial growth wasn't neutral or decentralized. It was deliberately structured to concentrate control in the hands of a small number of institutions that could then dictate terms to everyone else. By 1912, the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into the concentration of financial power, found that 18 individuals held 341 directorships in 112 corporations, with aggregate resources of over $22 billion. That was roughly 1/4 of the entire wealth of the United States at the time, controlled by 18 people. The roots didn't just go deep, they merged into a single system that choked out everything that tried to grow independently. Now, let's address the counter-argument, because there is one, and it's worth taking seriously. The defenders of this system point out that, despite all the exploitation and consolidation, the standard of living in the United States did improve during this period. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality decreased. Access to goods expanded. That's true. It's also incomplete. Yes, the average American in 1920 was materially better off than the average American in 1870. But that improvement came at a pace and distribution that was determined entirely by the people who controlled the root systems. Workers didn't get higher wages because the system was generous. They got higher wages because they organized, went on strike, and sometimes died demanding them. Safety regulations didn't appear because industrialists suddenly cared about worker welfare. They appeared because enough workers were maimed and killed that the political cost of doing nothing became too high. The question isn't whether things got better. The question is whether they got better as fast as they could have, and whether the people who created the wealth shared proportionally in the benefits. When you look at the distribution, the answer is no. The top 1% of earners in 1920 controlled 40% of the wealth. The bottom 50% controlled about 5%. The trees were 40 miles tall, but most people were still living in the shadow. Let's examine one final root system. Immigration policy. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 23 million immigrants arrived in the United States. This is taught as a story about opportunity, about huddled masses seeking freedom and finding success. But look at it from the perspective of industrial capital. That influx of labor kept wages suppressed for decades. Every time workers in a factory organized for better conditions, factory owners could replace them with newly arrived immigrants who were desperate enough to work for less. This wasn't an accidental side effect. It was explicit policy. Henry Ford, celebrated as the man who paid workers $5 a day, which was double the prevailing wage at the time, didn't do it out of generosity. He did it because his assembly line work was so monotonous and degrading that turnover was over 370% annually. He couldn't keep a workforce stable. The $5 wage wasn't charity. It was the minimum price required to keep human beings willing to endure conditions that would otherwise drive them away. And even that wage came with conditions. Ford employed a team of investigators called the Sociological Department, who would visit workers' homes to ensure they were living in a manner Ford deemed appropriate. If you were spending your wages on alcohol, or if your home was too dirty, or if you were involved in labor organizing, you could be fired and lose access to the $5 wage. The roots weren't just deep and invasive. They extended into the private lives of the people who kept the system running. Here's the synthesis. The economic explosion of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States did create unprecedented wealth. That part of the story is true, but the mechanism by which that wealth was created and distributed was not a free market operating on a level playing field. It was a system where public resources were transferred to private control, where monopolies were enabled by law and enforced by state violence, where wages were suppressed through deliberate policy, and where the people who actually built the infrastructure and operated the machinery received a fraction of the value they created. The trees grew 40 miles tall, but the roots didn't just go deep, they consumed everything. And here's the part that connects to today. The same root systems still exist, they just have different names. The land grants became intellectual property law. The railroad monopolies became platform monopolies. The Pinkertons became union-busting law firms. The tariffs became tax structures that favor capital over labor. When you hear someone say that wealth is created by risk-taking entrepreneurs who deserve everything they earn, remember the roots. Remember the 180 million acres of land. Remember the workers who died at Homestead. Remember the immigrants who worked for starvation wages because the alternative was starvation without work. The question isn't whether the trees should have been tall. The question is who paid to grow them, and who gets to decide how the timber is distributed. Because if we're being honest, most of the people who cleared the ground, planted the seeds, and tended the roots never got to see the canopy. There's a specific example that crystallizes this system: the Pullman strike of 1894. George Pullman built a company town outside Chicago where his workers lived. Clean streets, maintained houses, schools, churches, everything a worker needed. But workers rented homes from Pullman at rates consuming most of their wages. They bought from company stores at inflated prices. When the 1893 panic hit and Pullman cut wages 25%, he didn't reduce rents. Workers paid the same housing costs on 3/4 of their income. After rent and necessities, families had almost nothing. Some survived on bread and water for weeks. When workers struck, Pullman shut down operations and evicted strikers from company housing. Families with children were thrown onto winter streets. The strike spread nationwide. Railway workers refused to handle Pullman cars. The Western rail system halted. President Cleveland sent federal troops to break the strike. 30 workers were killed. Eugene Debs was jailed. The strike collapsed. Pullman died 3 years later, one of the wealthiest men in America. His workers died in poverty. The lesson wasn't that company towns were exploitative. The lesson was that federal troops could protect corporate interests whenever necessary. The roots did not just extract resources, they had the full weight of government backing them up. Now, consider how this pattern repeats across the entire industrial landscape. The coal mines of West Virginia and Pennsylvania operated under a similar model. Mining companies owned the towns, the stores, the housing. Workers were paid in script. Company-issued currency that could only be spent at company stores. This meant miners never actually held legal tender. They couldn't save. They couldn't leave. They were locked into a system that guaranteed the mine owners captured every dollar that entered the local economy. When miners tried to organize, the companies hired private armies. The Baldwin Felts Detective Agency became infamous for evicting striking miners and their families at gunpoint. In 1921, during the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 coal miners armed themselves and fought against company forces and state police. In what remains the largest labor uprising in American history, federal troops with bomber aircraft were deployed. The rebellion was crushed. This wasn't ancient history. This happened in living memory of people who are still alive today. And the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed as much as we like to pretend. The mechanisms are more subtle now. The violence is more bureaucratic, but the root system still extracts wealth from the bottom and concentrates it at the top. When you hear politicians talk about how America became great through free enterprise and limited government, remember that the government gave away 180 million acres, deployed federal troops to break strikes, and maintained tariff policies that functioned as direct subsidies to industrial capital. When you hear business leaders talk about how regulations stifle innovation, remember that the absence of regulation in the Gilded Age meant children working in coal mines and factory workers dying from preventable injuries at rates that would be considered industrial genocide today. When you hear economists talk about how the market efficiently allocates resources, remember that J.P. Morgan and 17 other men controlled 1/4 of the nation's wealth and used that control to dictate terms to the entire economy. The free market mythology depends on ignoring the roots. It depends on starting the story after the land has already been transferred, after the monopolies have already been established, after the infrastructure has already been built with public resources, and pretending that what happens next is the result of pure competition and merit. But if you include the roots, the story changes completely. The fortunes at the top weren't just earned. They were subsidized, protected, and enforced by the same government that's now portrayed as having been absent from the economy. There's a reason the wealthiest people in America today are disproportionately concentrated in industries that depend on government-granted monopolies. Whether that's intellectual property law, telecommunications infrastructure, or financial system access, the mechanism hasn't changed. Only the narrative has. And that brings us to the final and uncomfortable truth. The reason this revisionist history matters isn't just academic. It's because the same arguments used to justify the Gilded Age are being used to justify wealth concentration today. The same claim that government intervention distorts markets. The same insistence that the wealthy earned everything they have through superior merit. The same framing that portrays any attempt to redistribute resources as theft from the productive class. But when the roots go that deep, when the foundation of the entire system is built on public subsidy and state enforcement, the question of who earned what becomes much more complicated. The workers who died building the railroads earned something. The children who worked in factories earned something. The families evicted from Pullman earned something. They just didn't get it. The trees grew 40 miles tall because the roots consumed everything. And the people who benefited from that height now want you to believe it happened naturally, that it was inevitable, that it was fair. Fair would have meant the people who cleared the ground got to share the canopy. Fair would have meant the workers who built the railroads owned part of the system they created. Fair would have meant Andrew Carnegie's library donations came from profits that didn't require killing workers who asked for living wages. What we call the Gilded Age wasn't the free market at work. It was one of the largest transfers of public wealth into private hands in human history, enforced by state violence and justified by an economic mythology that we're still being taught today. The question isn't whether capitalism can create wealth. Obviously, it can. The question is who gets to decide how that wealth is created, who bears the cost, and who controls the distribution. Because right now, just like in 1890, the people making those decisions are the same people who benefit most from the current arrangement. The roots are still there. They've just learned to grow deeper while staying out of sight. Think about what happens when this pattern continues for generations. The railroad barons' children inherited empires. The steel magnates' grandchildren attended elite universities built with fortunes extracted from workers who never learned to read. Wealth compounds structurally. When your great-grandfather received 40 million acres for free, your grandfather used it as collateral for loans that became a diversified portfolio. Nobody competed on merit alone. Meanwhile, workers' descendants inherited the same extractive system. Some escaped through education or talent combined with luck. Most remained in the same relative economic position their great-grandparents occupied in 1890. This is path dependence. The less polite term is class entrenchment. The honest term is that the game was rigged, and the riggers ensured their descendants would keep winning. When Andrew Carnegie wrote about the moral obligations of the wealthy, he wasn't wrong that rich people should give back. He was wrong thinking charity could compensate for a system that required workers to die so he could build libraries. The revisionist history isn't about tearing down industrial America's accomplishments. It's about telling the complete story, because if we don't understand how the system actually worked, we can't have an honest conversation about how it works now. The final piece is what happened when the system started to crack. The progressive era, the New Deal, labor victories. They weren't gifts. They were concessions, forced by people who had finally had enough. When workers struck and died for the 8-hour workday, they weren't asking favors. They were demanding their share. When women fought for suffrage, they were claiming power in a system that excluded them. Every protection you take for granted exists because someone fought for it against people who insisted it would destroy the economy. Every time the people at the top predicted catastrophe, every time they were wrong, the economy didn't collapse when child labor was banned. It didn't collapse with the 40-hour week. What collapsed was an arrangement where all risk fell on workers and all reward flowed to owners. The trees are still 40 miles tall. The roots still extract everything they can reach. The difference is better stories about why this is natural and fair. More sophisticated economics explaining why alternatives would be worse. But strip away the sophistication and the same structure remains. Public resources transferred to private control. Monopolies protected by law. Workers bearing risk. Owners capturing reward. State power maintaining the arrangement. The roots go deep. Deeper than most people want to acknowledge. Until we're willing to look at the whole system, we'll keep having the same arguments about why some have everything and most have just enough to keep going.